cultural footprint left by Johnny Carson is arguably larger than that of any other figure in the history of television. For 30 years, he was not just a guest in our living rooms. He was the nightly anchor for a nation that craved stability and levity during decades of immense societal change. When we examine his legacy, we're looking at a man who essentially codified the late-night talk show format, turning a simple premise of conversation and comedy into a ritualistic experience. Yet the very discipline that allowed him to master the medium of television created a rigid framework that became increasingly difficult to apply to the messy, unpredictable nature of real human relationships. Understanding Carson requires us to look past the suit, the jokes, and the impeccable timing to see a man who treated his professional output as an exact science, while his personal life often felt like an equation he could never quite solve. To truly grasp the dichotomy of Johnny Carson, one must acknowledge the immense pressure cooker that was NBC's The Tonight Show. In an era before the internet and on-demand streaming, the late-night host held a position of singular power. Millions of Americans went to sleep hearing his voice, trusting his perspective, and laughing at his observational humor. This level of influence requires a persona that is both accessible and untouchable, a balance that Carson managed with almost supernatural grace. He projected a version of himself that was the everyman, yet he remained a mystery to his audience. This cultivated distance was, in part, his greatest professional asset as it kept viewers intrigued, but it also became a psychological barrier that prevented those closest to him from feeling truly seen or understood. When we talk about the professional versus the personal, we often frame it as a conflict of time management, but with Carson, it was a fundamental conflict of identity. He was an artist whose canvas was the television screen. He knew exactly how to manipulate the camera, the audience reaction, and the flow of a conversation to achieve perfection. However, this level of control is inherently incompatible with family dynamics, which thrive on vulnerability, messiness, and the ability to surrender one's ego. In the workplace, he was the final authority, the captain of the ship who could steer the conversation wherever he pleased. At home, he was not the authority, and he was not the star of the show, a transition that proved to be exceptionally difficult for him to navigate throughout his life. Testimony from his sons provides the most harrowing glimpse into this struggle, specifically the observation that work was easy for him while family was not. This sentiment, while simple, captures the profound tragedy of a man who could command a room of millions, but felt entirely alienated in a room of four. It highlights the discrepancy between his innate talent for performance and his profound inability to perform the role of a father or husband in a way that felt authentic and sustainable. When we analyze this behavior, we see someone who perhaps viewed relationships through the lens of performance. If there was no applause, no laughter, or no clear objective, he simply did not know how to engage or how to sustain interest. It is worth considering that Carson was a product of a different generation, one where the professional man was expected to be the provider rather than the nurturer. Yet even by the standards of his time, the accounts of his emotional distance are striking. We see a recurring pattern where he seemingly exhausted his capacity for empathy and social engagement during his hours in the studio, leaving nothing left for those who arguably needed it the most. This wasn't necessarily out of malice, but rather an emotional depletion that many high-functioning individuals experience. He was a professional vessel, emptied completely by his duty to the audience, leaving a hollow space where his domestic life should have thrived. The complexity of his first marriage to Jodie Walcott acts as a case study for the friction caused by his meteoric rise to fame. As the demands of the show grew, the household became a secondary concern, a place where he retreated to recover rather than to connect. This transition from a partner to a ghost in one's own home is a classic narrative of the entertainment industry, but with Carson, it was exacerbated by his need for intense privacy. He was a man who, by his own admission, felt more comfortable in the public eye than in the private sphere. This irony defines his existence. He was a public property who guarded his own humanity with a ferocity that ultimately isolated him from his family. When we analyze the upbringing of his three sons, Chris, Rick, and Corey, we're looking at the collateral damage of a career that demanded total commitment. They grew up watching a version of their father that was available to the entire world, a man who was warm, witty, and profoundly empathetic toward children he interviewed on air. To see your father offer the gift of his undivided attention to a complete stranger while simultaneously withholding it from you creates a unique psychological dissonance. It is a form of abandonment that is all the more painful because it is so visible. It leaves a child wondering if they are simply not interesting enough to command the attention of a man who defines the very concept of being interesting. The role of alcohol in this dynamic cannot be overstated, as it serves as a catalyst for the darker, more volatile side of his personality. Many biographers and close associates have pointed to the fact that for Carson, drinking did not lead to relaxation but rather to a shift in temperament. It effectively dismantled the carefully constructed persona of the calm host, revealing a layer of frustration, and at times, explosive aggression that was hidden from the cameras. This is a common phenomenon in individuals who spend their lives suppressing their true emotions to maintain a professional facade. The mask eventually slips, and when it does, the repressed intensity comes rushing out in unpredictable ways. In examining the testimony of his second wife, Joanne Copeland, we encounter the most direct evidence of this duality. To be told that one is married to two different people is a profound indictment of a person's inability to integrate their public and private selves. This oscillation between the composed professional and the unpredictable angry spouse is the hallmark of a man who is living two entirely different lives, neither of which feels complete. The fact that he could wake her in the middle of the night demanding recognition for his hard work speaks to a deep-seated insecurity that even his massive professional success could not fill. He was starved for validation, yet he didn't know how to receive it in the quiet, intimate moments where it is most needed. The cycle of anger and regret that plagued his marriages is a tragic, repetitive loop that suggests a lack of emotional regulation. He would hurt those closest to him, only to feel profound shame the next day, yet the pattern would inevitably repeat itself. This is the hallmark of a person who is trapped by their own behavioral conditioning. He knew he was failing, and the shame he felt likely drove him further into his work, and subsequently further into his isolation. It is a vicious cycle where the pursuit of professional perfection becomes a way to distract from, and a way to justify, personal failure. Looking at his relationship with his mother is essential for any analysis of Carson's character. Many who have studied his life note that she was emotionally distant and rarely offered him the affirmation he craved. This creates a psychological vacuum that a person often spends their entire adult life trying to fill. For Carson, the audience became his mother. They provided the applause, the love, and the validation that he never received at home. The Tonight Show was not just a job, it was an emotional tether that kept him grounded in a way that his own family never could. He was playing a game of catch-up with his own self-worth, and he was using the American public as his opponent. The irony of his career is that he taught America how to laugh, how to be casual, and how to feel like everything was under control, while his own life was arguably in a state of perpetual quiet crisis. We must ask whether he was a victim of his own talent or a perpetrator of his own choices. It is likely a mixture of both. He possessed a rare, singular talent that the world demanded, and he gave his life to it. The cost of that talent, however, was his ability to function as a regular human being in the context of a family. He was, in a very real sense, a man who gave his best version to everyone but the people he was supposed to love most. We should also consider the impact of the era in which he operated. During the 60s, 70s, and 80s, the concept of therapy or emotional transparency in high-profile men was virtually non-existent. There was a stoicism required of men of his stature, a stiff upper lip mentality that discouraged looking inward or addressing one's own trauma. Carson was the ultimate embodiment of that era's ethos. He was impenetrable, a granite-like figure who could handle anything in front of a camera, which meant he was also incapable of showing the kind of vulnerability that would have been required to save his marriages or heal his relationship with his sons. The tragedy of his third marriage to Joanna Holland highlights the progressive decay of his ability to maintain stability. By this point, the effects of his lifestyle and his internal emotional distance were deeply embedded. When you live with a person who has no predictable emotional baseline, you are living in a state of constant low-level trauma. The unpredictability of his outbursts, triggered by even minor stressors, indicates that his emotional regulation was effectively non-existent. He had become a man whose primary mode of communication was the monologue, not the dialogue. Throughout this analysis, it is important to avoid a reductionist view. Johnny Carson was not a villain, but a deeply flawed, complex human being whose professional success was perhaps his greatest tragedy. When we watch his old clips, we see the charisma, the wit, and the charm. But when we hear the stories of his children and his ex-wives, we are confronted with the reality that human connection is a skill, and it is a skill that cannot be outsourced to the public or replaced by the roar of an audience. His life serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of defining one's self-worth entirely through professional accomplishment. What did he see when he went home at night? Did he see a life he had built, or did he see a set that he was relieved to be off of? This is the central question of his biography. If we look at the way he lived, it suggests he was always most at peace when he was on. The moments of silence in his house were likely the hardest to endure. He was a man who spent his life creating a buffer between himself and the rest of the world, and that buffer eventually became an impenetrable wall that even his loved ones couldn't breach. His interactions with child guests on his show remain one of the most interesting aspects of his career. He treated them with a level of patience and genuine curiosity that, in hindsight, feels like a performance of the father he wished he could be or the father he felt he should be. He was essentially auditioning for the role of the nurturing figure, but only on camera where the boundaries were clear and the interaction had an expiration date. It is a haunting image, a man who could easily connect with any child on Earth as long as it was for a 6-minute segment on national television. The lack of emotional intelligence in his upbringing, combined with his own refusal to seek growth, solidified his trajectory. He was the product of a home that didn't provide him with the tools for intimacy, and he never made the effort to acquire those tools later in life. He was trapped in a cycle of his own making, where his success only reinforced his belief that his current way of being was the correct one. After all, if the world loved him just the way he was, why would he ever feel the need to change? This documentary analysis is not designed to diminish his accomplishments, but to contextualize them within the reality of his human experience. He changed the landscape of American culture, and for that he is deservedly remembered. However, to celebrate the host while ignoring the man is to deny the full truth of his life. We must hold both sides of him, the brilliant performer and the broken father. This complexity is what makes him a figure of enduring interest. He represents the ultimate American trade-off, the cost of achieving legendary status. As we move forward, we should hold on to the image of the man in the studio, but also keep the memory of the man in his home. His life is a reminder that while the world will celebrate what you do, the people around you will only care about who you are. Carson was a man who was loved by millions but perhaps never truly known by anyone, including perhaps himself. He remains a monument to the power of performance, and a warning about the fragility of the human connections that we often take for granted until it is far too late. The transition from a man who dominated the cultural conversation to a man who eventually faded into a quiet retirement is one of the most poignant chapters of Johnny Carson's life. As he stepped away from the desk that defined his identity for 30 years, the loss of his professional purpose brought the underlying fractures of his personal life into sharper focus. Without the daily rhythm of the show, he was finally forced to occupy the silence that he had spent his entire life avoiding. For a man who lived through the lens of constant activity and public feedback, the quiet of retirement was not just a change of pace, it was a fundamental shift in his existential reality. He was a performer without a stage, a host without guests, and a man who was still struggling to build a home within his own skin. One of the most devastating elements of his story involves his son Rick. The relationship between them, defined largely by distance, and a lack of emotional support during Rick's own personal trials, represents a profound failure of the parental connection that even Carson's immense wealth could not fix. When we look at how mental health was managed during those decades, we see a societal reluctance to acknowledge the pain that exists beneath the surface of success. Carson, in his private way, seems to have internalized this societal silence, treating his son's struggles as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a crisis to be addressed with compassion. This decision to remain at a distance, to keep his son's needs away from the public gaze, was a choice that ultimately cost him the possibility of redemption. Death of Rick in 1991 remains the most haunting element of the Carson legacy, a moment that shattered the curated image of a man who was always in control. When a parent loses a child, the silence that has existed between them becomes permanent, a void that can no longer be bridged by words or actions. Carson's decision not to attend the memorial service, while technically explained as a desire to prevent a media spectacle, speaks to a deeper, more complex internal state. It suggests a man who was so terrified of the public's perception that he was willing to forego the intimacy of mourning his own flesh and blood. It was the ultimate sacrifice of the personal to the professional, a decision that has been scrutinized by historians and biographers as a sign of his deep emotional detachment. Yet when he finally addressed the loss on air, we saw a glimpse of the man who existed beneath the armor. His brief, vulnerable monologue was not just a moment of shared grief with his audience, it was a rare acknowledgement of the humanity he had been suppressing for so long. For a few minutes the host vanished and the father appeared. It was a poignant reminder of what might have been, had he been able to access that level of vulnerability in his day-to-day life. That single moment of honesty did more to humanize him than his decades of perfection ever could, revealing that the lack of connection wasn't a lack of feeling, but a lack of capacity to express it. This moment also forces us to consider the burden of the legend status. When an individual reaches a certain level of cultural prominence, they often become a prisoner of their own image. The public did not want Johnny Carson to be a grieving father. They wanted him to be the sharp-witted, composed host who made everything feel safe. By adhering to this script, Carson may have felt he was serving his audience, but he was simultaneously suffocating his own reality. This is the tragic paradox of celebrity. The more people think they know you, the harder it becomes to be known by the few who actually matter. The emotional distance that characterized his relationships with his wives, Jody, Joanne, and Joanna, was not just a product of his personality, but a reflection of his inability to be truly present. Each of his first three marriages struggled under the weight of his emotional unavailability and the volatility that alcohol seemed to exacerbate. We see a man who was constantly searching for a partner who could understand his burden, yet he was never able to offer the emotional labor required to sustain a healthy partnership. It is a cycle of searching and failing that speaks to a profound dissatisfaction that he couldn't quite name or address. The influence of his mother on his adult relationships is a thread that runs through almost every analysis of his life. If we view his personality as a construct formed in response to a parent who was cold and unreachable, his entire professional career becomes a reaction to that trauma. He spent his life performing for a maternal surrogate, the viewing audience, hoping to earn the love and affirmation that was denied to him in childhood. This explains why he was so good at being liked by millions and so bad at being intimate with one person. He was addicted to the love of the crowd because it was unconditional and abstract, whereas the love of family was specific, messy, and demanding. By the time he met his fourth wife, Alexis Moss, it is clear that he had reached a point of exhaustion with the cycle of his previous lives. The calm that characterized his final years was not necessarily a sign that he had mastered his demons, but rather that he had finally stopped trying to fight them with the same intensity. He had retreated from the stage, and in doing so, he had created a safe, controlled environment where he could finally rest. It is a softer ending to a life that was marked by so much high-stakes tension and emotional turbulence. Yet we must be careful not to romanticize this later period as a complete redemption. Redemption implies a repair of what was broken, and while he may have found peace, the relationships he had damaged remained in their fractured state. The lives of his children and his ex-wives were forever altered by the choices he made when he was at his most powerful and his most absent. This is the reality of a life lived in the public eye. The consequences of our actions do not disappear when we retire, and the echoes of our past behavior continue to resonate long after we have stepped away from the spotlight. We must also consider the role of the media in protecting the Carson myth. For decades, the narrative was tightly controlled, and the complexities of his personal life were largely relegated to the realm of rumor or private anecdote. This silence served both the brand of The Tonight Show and the personal privacy of the man himself. However, in our modern era, we are more interested in the nuance of human behavior. We are no longer satisfied with the icon. We want to see the individual. This is why these stories are now surfacing. They are not an attempt to tear down a legend, but to see him as a whole person, warts and all. The drinking, while widely discussed, should be viewed as a symptom of his deeper issues rather than the primary cause of his life's challenges. Alcohol is often a form of self-medication for those who are struggling to navigate the pressures of a high-performance life. For Carson, it was a way to blur the edges of his world, to quiet the voice in his head that demanded more, better, and faster. It was a crutch that allowed him to keep functioning on the high level he expected of himself, even when his personal internal system was failing under the strain. If we look at his life through the lens of psychological development, we see a man who was stuck in a perpetual state of becoming. He was always working on the next joke, the next show, the next season. He never allowed himself to simply be. This perpetual motion machine of a career left no time for the quiet reflection necessary to build a sustainable life outside of the office. He was always running, and in the end, he had nowhere left to run to, which is perhaps why he chose such a quiet, secluded retirement. We also have to acknowledge the immense talent he possessed. There is no denying that he was the best at what he did. His comedic timing, his ability to read a room, and his instinct for the zeitgeist were unparalleled. This talent was a gift, but it was also a burden. It set such a high bar for his own life that anything less than total success felt like a failure. This internal standard of perfectionism likely bled into his expectations for his family, making it impossible for them to meet the standard he held for himself. The contrast between his public warmth and his private coolness is a haunting reminder that we never really know the people we watch on screen. We project our own desires onto them, filling in the blanks with our own hopes and dreams. We wanted Carson to be the fatherly, comforting figure, so we imagined he was. When reality challenged that image, it felt like a betrayal. But the reality is that he was just a human being, deeply flawed, undeniably talented, and fundamentally unable to bridge the gap between his public duty and his private needs. When we consider his legacy, we have to weigh the brilliance of his professional work against the complexity of his personal history. These two things are not mutually exclusive. They are the two sides of the same coin. The same drive that made him a genius on television made him an absentee father. The same focus that allowed him to master the late-night format left him without a roadmap for a long-term, stable marriage. We can appreciate the former while acknowledging the sadness of the latter. This is the task of any analytical documentary, to move beyond the surface level and explore the motivations and the consequences that make a person real. We are not interested in scandal for the sake of scandal. We are interested in understanding the human condition as it was experienced by a man who was more visible than almost anyone else in his lifetime. The lessons of his life are not just about him, they are about all of us and the choices we make about where we invest our energy, our love, and our focus. As we move toward the final chapter of this exploration, it is crucial to recognize that the story of Johnny Carson is one that continues to evolve. Each new piece of information, each new reflection from those who knew him, helps to round out the picture. We are not just looking at a man who defined an era, we are looking at a man who was defined by it, often in ways that he couldn't control. The silence that surrounded his final years was a choice, one that signaled a move toward peace. Whether that peace was genuine or simply the result of exhaustion is something we may never know for sure, but it stands as the final answer to the question of whether he could ever truly change. Perhaps he didn't need to change, but only to find a place where he could exist without the weight of expectations. In conclusion of this second part, we see that the arc of his life was one of intense singular focus. He gave everything to the world, and in doing so he left his own house empty. It is a powerful cautionary story that highlights the importance of finding balance, even when the world demands everything you have. We will continue this analysis in the final part, looking at the enduring nature of his influence and the final, lasting impact of his choices.